Sarah Martinez stood at the edge of the crowded military reception hall, holding her small glass of sparkling water with both hands. The ice clinked softly as her fingers trembled slightly from nerves. Around her, hundreds of people in elegant evening wear and military dress uniforms moved in small groups, their conversations creating a steady hum that filled the grand ballroom. She had been standing in the same spot for nearly an hour, watching as colleagues from her government office mingled effortlessly with high-ranking military officials and their families. Every few minutes, someone would brush past her without a glance, their attention focused on more important conversations with more important people. Sarah worked as a mid-level analyst in the Department of Defense, spending her days buried in reports and data that few people ever saw. Her job was crucial to national security, but it was the kind of work that happened behind closed doors, away from cameras and recognition. Tonight's annual military appreciation dinner was supposed to celebrate people like her, the unsung heroes who kept America safe from their desks and computer screens. But as she watched her supervisor, Mr. Henderson, laugh loudly with a group of colonels across the room, Sarah felt invisible. Henderson had introduced her to exactly two people when they arrived, both of whom had quickly excused themselves to find more interesting company. Since then, she had been standing alone, occasionally checking her phone and pretending to read important messages. The ballroom was magnificent, with crystal chandeliers casting warm light over polished marble floors and tables draped in crisp white linens. Military flags from all branches of service hung proudly along the walls, and a small orchestra played patriotic songs from a stage at the far end of the room. Sarah had never been to such an elegant event, and despite feeling out of place, she couldn't help but admire the grandeur of it all. She wore her best black dress, the one she had bought 3 years ago for her cousin's wedding and had worn only twice since. Her shoes, though pretty, were already making her feet ache, and she shifted her weight from one foot to the other as she continued her solitary vigil by the wall. A waiter passed by carrying a tray of champagne glasses, and Sarah shook her head politely when he offered her one. She didn't drink alcohol, especially not at work events, and besides, she was driving herself home tonight. The sparkling water was perfect, even if it made her feel even more different from everyone else who seemed to be enjoying the free champagne. As the evening progressed, Sarah watched the social dynamics of the room with the same analytical mind she used for her intelligence work. She noticed how certain people naturally drew crowds around them, how conversations flowed easily between those wearing stars and eagles on their uniforms, and how civilian contractors seemed to hover around the edges of these important groups, hoping for a chance to join in. Her own boss, Director Patricia Wong, was nowhere to be seen. Wong had been invited but had sent her regrets due to a family emergency, leaving Sarah to represent their entire intelligence division alone. The irony wasn't lost on her that the people who spent their lives analyzing threats and gathering critical information for military operations were now standing awkwardly around the edges of a party meant to honor their contributions. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message from her sister asking how the fancy dinner was going. She typed back a quick response. "It's beautiful here. Very elegant." She didn't mention that she had spoken to exactly 3 people all evening, not counting the waiter who offered her champagne. Near the main entrance to the ballroom, she noticed a small commotion. Several military police officers had taken positions by the doors, and staff members were speaking quietly into their radios. Sarah's training kicked in automatically, and she found herself observing the scene with professional interest. Someone important was clearly about to arrive, someone important enough to warrant additional security measures. The orchestra finished their current piece and began playing "Hail to the Chief," which made Sarah's eyebrows rise slightly. That was unusual for a military event unless someone really significant was making an appearance. She glanced around the room and noticed that many of the higher-ranking officers had stopped their conversations and were looking toward the entrance with expressions of surprise and curiosity. Sarah remained in her spot by the wall, reasoning that wherever she stood, she would probably have the same view of whatever was about to happen. Her position actually gave her a decent angle to see the entrance, and she was tall enough to see over most of the crowd even without moving closer. The conversations in the room gradually died down as more people became aware that something special was happening. The military police at the doors came to attention, and Sarah could see through the large windows that several black vehicles had pulled up outside the building. She checked her watch and realized the evening was only half over. The dinner portion hadn't even begun yet, and already she was looking forward to going home to her quiet apartment and her cat, Winston. She had promised herself she would stay until at least the main course was served, partly out of professional obligation and partly because she had never been to such an elegant event and wanted to experience it fully, even if she was experiencing it alone. The anticipation in the room was building, and Sarah found herself genuinely curious about who was about to make such a dramatic entrance. In her work analyzing intelligence reports, she had learned about the protocols surrounding visits from very high-ranking officials, but she had never witnessed one in person. As she waited with the rest of the crowd, Sarah couldn't help but think about how different her evening had been from what she had imagined when she first received the invitation 3 weeks ago. She had pictured herself having interesting conversations about her work, perhaps making professional connections, maybe even enjoying herself at a social event for once. Instead, she had spent most of the evening as a silent observer, watching other people's interactions and feeling like a stranger at her own organization's celebration. But as the excitement in the room continued to build around the mysterious arrival, Sarah found herself grateful for her analytical nature and her position as an observer. Whatever was about to happen, she had a front-row seat to witness it, even if no one else in the room seemed to notice she existed. The double doors at the entrance opened with a flourish, and Sarah watched as a 4-star general entered the ballroom, his uniform decorated with more ribbons and medals than she had ever seen on one person. The gold stars on his shoulders caught the light from the chandeliers as he walked with the confident bearing of someone who had commanded respect for decades. But he wasn't alone. To his right walked an Admiral, her navy dress blue uniform impeccable and her silver hair pulled back in a perfect bun. The Admiral's presence was equally commanding, and Sarah recognized her immediately from photographs she had seen in intelligence briefings. To the general's left strode a Marine general, his dress blue uniform with its high collar and red trim making him instantly recognizable as one of the Corps' highest-ranking officers. The room fell completely silent, except for the soft melody of the orchestra, which continued playing at a much lower volume. Sarah watched as every person in the ballroom seemed to freeze in place, drinks halfway to lips, conversations stopped mid-sentence. The 3 highest-ranking military officials she had ever seen in person were now standing in the same room where she had spent the evening feeling invisible. What happened next surprised everyone, including Sarah herself. Instead of being greeted by the event organizers or making their way toward the head table where other VIPs were seated, the 3 officers began walking directly toward Sarah's corner of the room. Their path was purposeful and unwavering, and Sarah looked around quickly to see who they might be approaching. Behind her was only the wall with its elegant wallpaper and a small table holding flower arrangements. To her left and right were empty spaces where other guests had gradually moved away throughout the evening to join more interesting conversations elsewhere. Sarah realized with growing confusion that she appeared to be their destination. The crowd began to part automatically as the 3 officers approached, creating a clear pathway that led directly to where Sarah stood, clutching her glass of sparkling water. Her heart began beating faster as she tried to understand what was happening. Had she done something wrong? Was she standing in a restricted area? Had her security clearance somehow been revoked without her knowledge? As they came closer, Sarah could see the details of their uniforms more clearly. The four-star general wore the insignia of the army, and she counted an impressive array of combat and service ribbons on his chest. The Admiral's uniform bore the gold wings of a naval aviator, and her ribbon rack told the story of a distinguished career at sea and in command positions. The Marine General's ribbons included decorations Sarah recognized from her intelligence work as being awarded only for extraordinary service in combat zones. When they were about 10 feet away, the general made eye contact with Sarah and smiled warmly. It wasn't the polite, formal smile she might have expected from such a high-ranking officer, but a genuine expression of recognition and pleasure. The Admiral and Marine General flanked him as they approached, both wearing similar expressions of respect and anticipation. Sarah's mind raced through possibilities. Did they have her confused with someone else? Was she blocking their path to someone important standing behind her? She glanced quickly over her shoulder again, but there was no one there. The nearest other guests were at least 20 feet away, all watching the unfolding scene with expressions of amazement and curiosity. The general stopped directly in front of Sarah, and she was surprised to realize that despite his impressive presence, he was actually not much taller than she was. His eyes were kind but sharp, the eyes of someone who had seen much and understood more. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of command but was warm and personal. "Ms. Martinez," he said, and Sarah's surprise deepened. He knew her name. "I've been looking forward to meeting you for quite some time." Sarah's glass trembled slightly in her hands as she struggled to find her voice. Around them, the entire ballroom had become an audience to their conversation, though the guests maintained a respectful distance. She could feel hundreds of eyes watching her, trying to understand why the evening's most distinguished arrivals had sought out the woman who had been standing alone all night. "Sir," she managed to say, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'm honored to meet you, though I have to admit I'm not sure why you're here." The Admiral stepped forward slightly and extended her hand to Sarah. "Ms. Martinez, your work on the Eastern European intelligence analysis has been exceptional. The briefings you prepared last month were instrumental in several critical decisions at the highest levels of our national security apparatus." Sarah shook the Admiral's hand, still trying to process what she was hearing. Her reports on Eastern European activities had been routine assignments, the kind of detailed analysis she prepared every week. She had no idea that anyone outside her immediate office had even read them, much less that they had reached the level of military leadership standing before her. The Marine General spoke next, his voice carrying the distinctive cadence of someone who had spent decades leading Marines in challenging situations. "Your analysis of the supply chain vulnerabilities you identified saved American lives, Ms. Martinez. Operations were modified based on your recommendations, and I wanted to thank you personally." Sarah felt her cheeks flush as the implications of their words began to sink in. Her quiet, behind-the-scenes work had apparently made its way to the very top levels of military command. The reports she typed at her small desk in a windowless office had influenced real military operations and potentially saved real lives. "I had no idea," she said honestly. "I just do my job and file my reports. I never hear what happens to them after that." The general nodded knowingly. "That's often how it works in intelligence. The best analysts rarely know the full impact of their contributions, but we know, and we wanted to make sure you knew how much your work matters." Around them, the crowd continued to watch in fascination. Sarah could see her supervisor, Mr. Henderson, standing with his mouth slightly open in apparent shock. Other colleagues from her office were pointing her out to their companions, trying to explain who she was to people who had ignored her presence all evening. The Admiral gestured toward the head table where other distinguished guests were seated. "We were hoping you would join us for dinner, Ms. Martinez. We have some questions about your recent analysis of the Black Sea situation, and we'd value your insights." Sarah looked down at her simple black dress and comfortable shoes. then up at the three most decorated military officers she had ever met. "Are you sure? I'm just an analyst. I don't usually attend these kinds of functions." The Marine general smiled, and Sarah could see that despite his serious demeanor, there was warmth in his expression. "Ms. Martinez, you're exactly the kind of person these functions should honor. You represent the best of what civilian intelligence professionals bring to our national defense." As they began walking toward the head table, Sarah became aware that every conversation in the room had stopped. People were openly staring now, trying to understand how the woman they had barely noticed all evening had suddenly become the center of attention for the most important people in the room. Sarah's mind was still reeling as she walked between the Admiral and the Marine general, with the four-star general leading their small procession through the crowd. For the first time all evening, she felt like she belonged at this elegant event, not because of her dress or her social connections, but because of the work she did every day in her quiet office, analyzing threats and providing the intelligence that kept America safe. The walk to the head table felt surreal to Sarah as she accompanied the three highest-ranking military officers in the room. Every step took her further from the wall where she had spent the evening invisible and closer to a world of recognition she had never imagined existed. The conversations that had stopped when the officers arrived remained suspended as guests watched her transformation from overlooked analyst to honored guest. As they reached the elevated head table, Sarah saw that a chair had been specifically prepared for her between the Admiral and a distinguished civilian she recognized as the Deputy Secretary of Defense. The general gestured for her to sit, and as she settled into her chair, she noticed that her hands were no longer trembling. The initial shock was giving way to a growing sense of confidence and belonging. The general took his seat across from her and leaned forward with genuine interest. "Ms. Martinez, your report on the unusual communication patterns in the Baltic region caught our attention immediately. Can you walk us through how you identified those anomalies?" Sarah found herself explaining her analytical process in detail, describing how she had noticed small inconsistencies in routine communications that others had dismissed as normal variations. As she spoke, she realized that the Admiral and Marine General were listening with the focused attention of professionals who understood the value of thorough intelligence work. "The pattern was subtle," Sarah continued, her confidence growing as she discussed her area of expertise. "But when I mapped the timing against known supply movements, it became clear that someone was coordinating activities across multiple networks in ways that suggested a level of planning we hadn't seen before." The Deputy Secretary of Defense turned to join their conversation, and Sarah found herself in the remarkable position of briefing some of the most powerful people in American national security while seated at the head table of a formal military dinner. Around the ballroom, she could see that other guests had resumed their conversations, but many were still glancing in her direction with new expressions of curiosity and respect. As dinner was served, the conversation continued to flow naturally. The Admiral shared insights from her naval experience that complemented Sarah's land-based intelligence analysis, while the Marine General asked probing questions that helped Sarah see her own work from different perspectives. She discovered that her reports were regularly discussed in high-level briefings and that recommendations based on her analysis had influenced deployment decisions and resource allocations. "You know," the general said as they were served the main course, "intelligence analysis is often a thankless job. You spend your days uncovering threats and identifying opportunities, but you rarely get to see the outcomes of your work. We wanted to change that, at least for tonight." Sarah learned that the three officers had specifically requested to meet her after reading her recent series of reports on emerging security threats. They had coordinated their schedules to attend this dinner specifically because they knew she would be there, and they wanted to personally thank her for contributions that had made a real difference in protecting American interests and lives. The Admiral explained how Sarah's analysis had led to the repositioning of naval assets in a way that prevented a potential international incident. The Marine general described how her insights into supply chain vulnerabilities had changed training protocols and possibly prevented attacks on American facilities overseas. Each revelation made Sarah realize that her quiet work had ripple effects she had never imagined. As the evening progressed, other distinguished guests approached their table to be introduced to Sarah. Word had spread quickly through the room about why the three top military leaders had sought her out, and suddenly everyone wanted to meet the unassuming analyst whose work was apparently so valuable that it commanded attention at the highest levels of military leadership. Her supervisor, Mr. Henderson, eventually made his way to the table, looking somewhat embarrassed, as he realized he had spent the evening ignoring his most accomplished team member. "Sarah," he said, "I had no idea your work was reaching these levels. We should talk next week about your career development." Sarah smiled graciously at Henderson, but her attention was focused on the broader implications of what she was learning. The general explained that there was a growing recognition in military circles of the critical importance of civilian intelligence analysts, and that people like Sarah were increasingly seen as essential partners rather than just support staff. "We're here tonight," the Marine general explained, "because we want to make sure that exceptional analysts like you know that your contributions are seen and valued at every level of our national defense structure. Too often, the people doing the most important work are the ones who never hear about its impact." As dessert was served, the Admiral presented Sarah with a letter of commendation signed by multiple service chiefs, recognizing her outstanding contributions to national security. The letter detailed specific operations that had been successful due to her analysis, including several that Sarah learned about for the first time that evening. The general stood and raised his glass, calling for the attention of the entire ballroom. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice carrying clearly across the room, "I want you to meet Ms. Sarah Martinez, whose intelligence analysis over the past year has directly contributed to the success of multiple critical operations and the safety of American personnel around the world." The ballroom erupted in applause as Sarah stood beside the table, overwhelmed by the recognition but also filled with a new understanding of her own value and importance. The same people who had walked past her earlier in the evening were now applauding her contributions, and she could see in their faces a new respect for the quiet work that people like her did every day. As the evening concluded, the Admiral handed Sarah her business card and invited her to attend future briefings where her expertise would be valuable. The Marine general offered to arrange for her to visit field operations where her analysis was being implemented so she could see firsthand how her work translated into real-world security measures. Walking out of the ballroom later that night, Sarah carried herself differently than when she had arrived. She was no longer the unnoticed woman standing alone by the wall, but a recognized professional whose contributions mattered at the highest levels of national security. Her quiet expertise had been revealed to be far more valuable and far-reaching than she had ever imagined. The drive home gave her time to process the evening's events. Her phone buzzed with messages from colleagues who had witnessed her recognition, and she realized that her professional relationships would likely be different from now on. But more importantly, she had a new understanding of her own worth and the impact of the work she loved. Sarah Martinez had discovered that sometimes the most important recognition comes not from seeking attention, but from doing excellent work consistently and professionally, even when it seems like no one is watching. The truth was that the people who mattered most had been watching all along, and they knew exactly how valuable her contributions were to keeping the country safe.